Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the United Nations World Food Program, commonly called WFP? What types of services does WFP provide to people who've been hit by civil war or natural disasters in areas such as the Philippines, Syria, Yemen, and many other areas of the world? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're taking a look at the United Nations World Food Program, commonly called WFP, and some of the services it provides to people who have been hit by civil war, natural disasters, and other calamities. My guest today is an expert on the World Food Program. My guest today is Mr. Amir Abdulla. Mr. Amir Abdulla is the Deputy Executive Director of the World Food Program. Mr. Abdulla is currently based in New York, and he oversees the World Food Program offices of Addis Ababa, Geneva, and New York. Mr. Abdulla, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. It's great to be here.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's start and talk about the World Food Program in general terms. When was it formed? Why was it formed? What is your basic mission?
Well, the World Food Program just very recently celebrated its 50th year. Founded in the early 60s, and really is the world's largest humanitarian agency fighting hunger. We're aiming, we're really there with the SDG 2 and trying to get to a zero hunger world. Originally founded with very much as a developmental agency. The idea was to use food aid surpluses or food surpluses around the world as a developmental aid tool, but within sort of at its birth, at its inception, found itself dealing with an earthquake in Iran and was pulled into an emergency even as it was being formed. So we've had that dual mandate of development and emergency, but over the last 2 or 3 decades have seen our humanitarian work really increase and increase.
Exactly. As I understand it, I believe you're serving something like 80 million people a year in 80 countries, primarily with food assistance and that type of thing, which is really quite an outreach. It's very...
Yeah, I mean, we've been at that number over the last several years, and we seem to have, that's basically what our budget can stretch to at the moment. There are many, many more people in other countries that are in need of assistance to get themselves to a zero hunger and to achieve food security. But what we're really looking at is the most vulnerable of the world's hungry, and we, as you said, are reaching about 80 million people in over 80 countries.
Exactly. And in the opening, I mentioned some areas: Philippines, Syria, Yemen, and a couple of others. There are many areas we could talk about, but we thought we'd focus on some of the international conferences that were convened by the United Nations to look at different problems, different challenges, shall we say, and then talk about, you can bring in some of these actual on-the-ground types of assistance as we go through this. But let's go back to last year. There were several major conferences. One was on disaster risk reduction. It was held in Sendai, Japan. What was the purpose of that, and why does it tie into what you're doing with the World Food Program, and what you're doing tie into what it's doing?
Well, as you said, I mean, 2015 was pretty much a historic year with several important conferences and summits along the way, paving the way for what has been quite a journey as the world gets itself ready to achieve hopefully sustainable development. But Sendai and disaster risk reduction was a huge important start to these series of summits. And from the World Food Program perspective, I mean, DRR and disaster risk reduction, it has been shown, there are many studies that show that more or less for every dollar that you spend in disaster risk, in preparedness, in mitigation and getting ready, can avert anything. Experts to say that it's up to potentially 20 to 30 times what it actually costs. Clearly, we know that it's well over 15. And with the level of humanitarian need at the moment around the world, of when these natural hazards basically turn into a disaster, compounding and being added on top of the conflict-driven ones. And we know that conflict is something that can be resolved, and with the right political solutions can be avoided. But perhaps sometimes that's more difficult to achieve. But in actual fact, dealing with the disasters that come out of natural hazards is something that we have the science, we have the means, we have the capacity. Really, we need to invest the resources in that to reduce humanitarian need that materializes if the hazard becomes a disaster.
Exactly. And of course, if there's a cyclone in the Philippines or an earthquake in Afghanistan, the United Nations World Food Program and other agencies too are on the ground to provide assistance to those people.
Yeah, and really, within disaster risk reduction, you have two elements of it. One is sort of preparedness and mitigation, if the hazard strikes. But then there is the fast response. And as you said, we are along with many other partners on the ground. And we've when the recent hurricane hit the Philippines, and we had the typhoon Haiyan the previous year. These were really events in which we saw the preparedness and mitigation that was in place, and a government that was, along with agencies, responded very, very fast, showed what you can achieve if you are ready. And then we're now in those same areas into what we call the recovery phase, which is actually when the often quoted term is build back better. And in a sense, it's you recover and you build back so that you can't avoid the hazard. These are natural hazards that will occur, but what you can avoid is the disaster.
Exactly. And of course, all these programs cost money. They don't operate on their own or out of thin air, and you need financial assistance on this. Now, there was a financing conference in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. What was the purpose of that conference, and how did it relate to what you're doing?
The Addis Ababa Conference on Financing for Development in July 2015 was hugely important because it brought together, the primarily governments of the world, but also, NGOs, civil society, the UN system members. We were all there, but it basically was a point at which everyone noted and agreed that if we want to achieve sustainable development, if we want to get to realize that goal of leaving no one behind and helping those who are furthest behind first, it will take money, it will take investment, but that is exactly that. It's an investment. And we often people use trade, not aid, but what we have to look at is this isn't so much about trade, but it is about investment, and actually getting the world to a more equitable place, but helping people realize their potential. And basically, if we can get people started, they don't want to live on handouts. So really what we were talking about there was the classic hand up rather than hand out, and it was actually about recognizing that these were, if we invested in sustainable development, and we would actually reduce the humanitarian burden and humanitarian bills. And one of the things I think that is, this was a very encouraging conference, and I think we got a lot of the right things were said there. We need obviously things that were said to materialize and turn into actions. But I think one of the things that has, I would say, I will use the word upset myself and many other people who are in this work like myself, is that it is so much often easier to actually resource and find funding after the disaster happens, when people really are, and it's important that we do that life-saving stuff, but it's not as easy to fund the activities that will stop them getting into that situation. And that's what we really have to turn to.
Exactly. As you were talking about that, I was thinking a lot of the foreign policy experts, and you can comment on this if you would, say that one way to help Syrian refugees, and we see the refugee populations exploding. The UN High Commission for Refugees is dealing with over 60 million refugees. 10 years ago, they were dealing with 10 million. I mean, it's just gone really beyond all proportions. But one of the key ways to help refugees is to help them to maintain a basic standard of living and stay in their area, assuming they're not in a war zone. And you see, I'm sure your resources are strained with the World Food Program, UNICEF's, all the others are with this overwhelming demand. But one way to do it would be to donate, would it not, to the World Food Program to provide additional assistance to help people stay in their areas, because many refugees have said, I'm going to starve to death or I'll die in this area, so why not try to go and cross the Mediterranean to go to Italy or Greece or wherever it might be? But would that not be a good way to provide assistance to them?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And really, we want to try and help people not even become refugees. In other words, to remain in their home country if possible. But as you pointed out, you know, if they are in a conflict zone or a war zone, they have often little choice but to move, and often that move takes them across a border and they become a refugee. But clearly helping them remain as close to home to increase the possibility that they will return home is clearly important. And yes, it's important that, you know, when they're in those situations, that we find a way to maintain them, that we give them the nutrition and food that they need. But it's also really important that we give them the potential and possibilities to start generating livelihoods for themselves, that we find education opportunities for their children. And in fact, the refugees who cross the Mediterranean and the land sort of transit countries that they went to when leaving the region around Syria, some of the horrific scenes that we saw on the television. But bearing in mind, that's a very small proportion of the numbers who were there. But many of them cited, yes, you know, not getting the right food and shelter. But for many, it was about education opportunities for their children. And I was very encouraged that during the September UN General Assembly that we had here, the number of side events that took place about education in emergencies and education in these. So there were some very encouraging signs there, and let's hope they materialize too.
Exactly. Now, our viewers can go to your website, www.wfp.org, and get more information about what we're talking about today. You mentioned September, the General Assembly, and there was another major event that took place in that the countries of the United Nations General Assembly signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals that will run for the next 15 years, 2015 to 2030, the Development Agenda. And of course, those goals are to eliminate poverty, to eliminate hunger. There are 17 of them. How many of those tie into what you're doing? I would imagine a large number of them would tie in directly to the services you're providing.
Yeah. Well, clearly, Sustainable Development Goal 2, SDG 2, which is about eliminating hunger and improving nutrition and food security for all, etc., speaks to the very essence of WFP. But I think that whole the SDG summit and the world coming together and signing off on those 17 goals in record time at the actual summit was a hugely important step. Yes, I mean, as you've mentioned, it seems like a lot, 17 goals, but they're all hugely important. I mean, I think, with number one being eradicating poverty is clearly, I would say, like the cornerstone or the base. But we feel from our perspective that, poverty and hunger often go, unfortunately, hand in hand. And so that was hugely important. But so many of the others, the goal on health, you don't have proper nutrition with health, the goal on education, hugely important, the goal on gender equity. We know in the work we do that if you don't have gender equity, you won't have proper food security, and sustainable cities, the climate change one, goal 13, all of them hugely important. 17, which is about partnerships, we're all in this together. So I think there are so many of those goals, and they all are intertwined. I think we're not going to really achieve one without focusing on all. So it really sets, as you said, the Agenda 2030. It sets where we need to go over those 15 years. But I think one of the themes that we saw through the whole of the discussions of this was that phrase of, leave no one behind and always try to reach those furthest behind first. And from the World Food Programme perspective, that really spoke right to the heart of what we do. But also what was most encouraging, I think, was that, you had humanitarian action and development action, often seen as, two almost like separate entities. And here we heard so many times that, humanitarian action must reinforce development, development must avoid humanitarian consequences in the future, and working together. And if the one thing that can come out of all of this is that we break down those divides, and that both as those of us who work in this area, but the donors who fund us, can realize that we really need both of this, and it's just two sides of the same coin, and we'll get there.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you have any involvement with any media outlet, be it with a website or PBS, Community Access Television, or a local university, intra-campus TV system, or whatever it might be, and you have an interest in the issues and the guests who are on the program, you're invited to go to the website and go to broadcasters and download the programs. They're provided free of charge as a public service to help people better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're taking a look at the United Nations World Food Program, and my guest today is an expert on this program. My guest today is Mr. Amir Abdulla. And Mr. Abdulla is the Deputy Executive Director of the UN World Food Program. We're talking about these conferences, and you brought up climate change a minute ago, and a lot of people believe that's our number one challenge, because we can look at a lot of problems and trace them right back to the changing climate, to climatic conditions, what have you. There was a major conference in Paris in December of last year, sponsored by the United Nations. What was the outcome of that, and how did it tie into the UN World Food Program, what you do and how you tie into it?
Again, another one step on the way of achieving Agenda 2030. And the Climate Change Conference in Paris, the Conference of Parties, or COP21, as it's fondly known, hugely important for the world, hugely important for all of us. And yes, for many believe that it is also at the base of many of the problems or solutions, and we need to come at it from that perspective. We recognize from a World Food Programme perspective, clearly achieving food security means that we have to deal with the impact of climate change, mitigate it where possible, and understand there is a huge interplay between those two key areas. We've seen droughts, floods, and other consequences of climate change, and even changes in weather patterns, changes in temperatures around the world are really impacting many growing areas. They impact very heavily on subsistence farmers, smallholders. Often don't have recourse to irrigation, and so if their agriculture is almost totally rain fed, so if the rain's patterns start to change, they have problems. So there's a lot at stake. I think, but the fact that we got the agreement, we got the signature. Everyone understands the problem. Nations are making commitments to their carbon dioxide production, on all the things that we needed to hear. We heard. I think again we do need to recognize that some of the resourcing and funding that's going to be needed to deal with this, unfortunately, again, huge sums of money that are needed, a lot of, at least I would say, promises, but we need to see promises materialize. But I think one of the things people do need to keep thinking about is, it sounds expensive, it sounds like a lot of money, but often if you really look at what will be the price tag of not doing anything, it is much higher. So again, a lot of encouraging signs there, and a hugely important impact, because climate change and its impacts impact, very much on the most vulnerable, those furthest behind. And as you said, it does affect many of the countries around the world. I mean, there are those who actually will point to the conflict in Syria actually being exacerbated by climate change patterns that have actually changed the rural agriculture, which actually meant that many subsistence farmers, their crops were failing. They moved into the cities. You had concentration of people in cities. So when the unrest and everything began, there were higher concentrations of people who had lost their livelihoods from countryside, now in the cities and now in the towns. And they unfortunately got engulfed in the conflict, and many young men found themselves with little choice but to join some of the armed groups. And so, you could, and there are many other examples.
That's a very good point, because we normally think we don't connect climate change with civil unrest, but in that case, and many other cases too, you see there have been fights over water rights. You see water supplies are dwindling, more and more countries, and even within countries, groups are fighting one another to some degree to get these very scarce resources. Well, we're talking about humanitarian activities, and there's a major conference coming up, a humanitarian summit that's coming up in early spring in Istanbul, Turkey. What is this World Humanitarian Summit? What is the purpose of it?
Again, I would say it's another step on the road to Agenda 2030, and the World Humanitarian Summit will, I think, really have at its heart those who are furthest behind. The achieving sustainable development, the SDGs talks about leaving no one behind and going for those furthest behind. Istanbul and the World Humanitarian Summit will remind us all who are the furthest behind. I think it will also be another opportunity to really pull the humanitarian and development communities again closer together to recognize that. But it will also be that point in time where we can have a discussion about the financing needs, which are huge, but recognize that the alternative of not meeting them, or not doing what we can when we can can result in even more costly alternatives later on. We will have that opportunity to look at making sure that we use all resources available. There will be a lot that goes on in Istanbul about what we refer to as first responders or local communities, and these are often national-based NGOs, the civil society organizations who form a backbone of first responders. And we within the World Food Programme work very closely with many of them. We work with over 1,000 NGOs around the globe, many of them local and national NGOs. And so there will be many actors there. But of course, it'll be hugely important that governments are there, and at the highest level, so that there can be a commitment towards reaching the most vulnerable and helping us achieve that, leaving no one behind. I think it also will come against the backdrop, as you said earlier on, about the highest level number of displaced and refugees, over 60 million, and it will be an opportunity for us to focus on what are their humanitarian needs, but also what are their longer term needs, and can we get longer term solutions to help those people. So it really is, I see it as a real another sort of step on the way, or another brick in the wall that will actually that we are building for Agenda 2030, but a hugely important one.
Now, there were 4 themes, and I think you pretty much covered them just a moment ago, which is very good. One, though, in our last minute and a half that we have, is transformation through innovation. What do you think will be some of the ideas that will come out as far as innovation in dealing with the issues that you're confronting today?
I think the innovation theme is going to be hugely important. We're using a lot of technological advances to help us with our monitoring and our reporting, but there are many things that we can do more of, and in fact, we're using satellite imagery to actually help us look at movement patterns, overlay them with climate change patterns, overlay them with potential migration routes in case that happens. But I think it's really about technology in the hands of individuals. We use them now, whereas in the past to do needs assessments, we would actually either have to send countless number of monitors into the field and collect data by hand. We now actually are relying, on the mobile telephone technology that those were serving carry. I mean, the number of mobile telephones in the world is astronomical, and we're able to use that for people to let us know where they are and what's happening. We can use questionnaires, filled and filed that way. But I think also we're finding that using some innovative means to keep costs down are hugely important too.
Exactly. Well, Mr. Amir Abdulla, the issues we've been talking about today are so very, very critically important, not only the people in the area who are the recipients, but people all around the world, because we are interlinked. And again, our viewers can go to your website, www.wfp.org, to get more information about what we're talking about today. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you,
Bill. Thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.